My name is Tessa Harwood. I'm 69 years old, a retired nurse, and a widow. For most of my life, I worked in the same hospital in Oregon, the kind with faded walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and patients who remembered your name if you were kind enough to hold their hand when no one else did. I gave my whole self to that place. I helped people through pain, through fear, through birth and death. I never made headlines. I never made demands. I just showed up. Every single day. And then one morning I showed up in court. My heels clicked awkwardly across the courtroom floor as I walked in, too aware of how out of place I looked. I wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a gray cardigan over a dress I had ironed twice out of nerves. My hands clutched the edge of my purse like it was the only anchor I had left. Across the room, my daughter Bree turned. She caught sight of me and immediately rolled her eyes. She leaned into her husband, Eric, whispering something that made him smirk. I stood there, not quite sure where to sit, not quite sure if I should sit at all. A woman in the gallery narrowed her eyes at me, scanning me from my shoes to my thinning silver hair. But then, something strange happened. The judge, a man in his 50s with a sharp jawline and weary eyes, looked up from his papers. His expression froze mid-sentence. He blinked once, then again, his pen slipping from his fingers and landing on the desk with a soft clatter. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible, then louder with unmistakable recognition. "It's her." A hush swept through the courtroom like a sudden wind. No one moved. No one spoke. For a moment, even Bree looked confused. No one knew who I used to be. But that moment, that frozen stare from the judge, cracked open something that had been buried for decades. Thank you for listening. If you've ever felt like your quiet sacrifices were invisible, or that people only remember the parts of you that serve their convenience, stay with me. This isn't just a story about courtrooms or property. It's about how we reclaim ourselves, even when everyone thinks we're past our prime. Now let me take you back to where it all began. After Hank passed away, I stayed in the house we built together, a modest place with creaky floorboards and a cherry tree out front that refused to bloom after he died. Bree had already moved out years before, married to a man who shook my hand with too much pressure and a smile that never reached his eyes. They visited less and less. Holidays became text messages. Phone calls turned into voicemails that were never returned. I told myself they were busy. New jobs, new responsibilities, maybe even a baby on the way. But deep down, I felt it. That quiet shift, that slow distancing. I had once imagined Bree would take care of me when I got older, not out of duty, but out of love. The kind of love you build through bedtime stories and packed lunches and sitting in the rain during her soccer matches when she was 12. But life doesn't always return what you give. The day they told me they were considering options for my living arrangements, they brought over a homemade apple pie, Bree's favorite as a child, still warm, still fragrant. She placed it on my kitchen counter like it was some sort of peace offering. Eric leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, surveying the room like it already belonged to him. "We just think," Bree said softly, "it's time you consider somewhere easier. A facility with help. You'd have friends, a social life." Eric added, "And we can help you take care of the property. Sell it while the market's still good." Sell it. That house wasn't just wood and paint. It was Hank's hands sanding down the staircase banister every spring. It was Bree's pencil markings still etched in the pantry wall, measuring how tall she grew each year. It was the place I returned to after every long shift, where Hank waited with tea and silence, the good kind of silence. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded and asked them if they wanted some pie. I had cut 2 slices before they realized I wasn't answering them. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after they left. The pie sat untouched. The fridge hummed softly, the only sound in the house. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me and stared at the empty chair across from me, Hank's chair. Somewhere in that silence, I felt something harden inside me, Not anger, not yet, just a quiet decision. The next few weeks moved in slow motion. Boxes appeared in my living room without my consent. Eric returned with a lawyer whose handshake was colder than his smile. Papers were placed in front of me with highlighted sections and clipped tones. I was told not to worry, that it was all standard procedure. They said I had been forgetful lately, that maybe my signature needed a witness, just in case. Lois, my next-door neighbor for the past 25 years, stood by her window every time they visited. She never waved, but she watched, quietly. I was being erased, efficiently, politely. But life has its own rhythm. Sometimes it loops back in ways you never expect. And as I stood in that courtroom, the very place they thought would seal my fate, I realized something. The story they were telling about me, the helpless old woman, the liability, the burden, was only one version, and I had another. After the courtroom incident, I found myself back in my house, standing by the sink, staring out the kitchen window at the brittle branches of the cherry tree. It was late October. The leaves had started to fall in clusters, like the quiet unraveling of something once full of life. I stood there with a chipped porcelain mug between my hands. It was one of those old hospital gift shop mugs, the kind nurses exchange during holidays. The rim had a tiny crack, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I kept it. Anyway, it held my tea the same as it always had. My life had become a series of quiet rituals like that. Morning tea at 7, feeding the cat that no longer came around, turning on the radio but not really listening, folding towels with precision, sitting in silence long enough to hear the house breathe. People didn't see you anymore once you hit a certain age. You became part of the wallpaper, pleasant, faded, forgettable. The neighbor, who never caused trouble. The woman who used to be someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's coworker. They forget you had a name before you were just grandma or ma'am. After Hank passed, it was just me. The silence was new at first, then familiar, then heavy. I used to reach for a second teacup every morning. I don't know when I stopped. Bree came by less often, and when she did, she looked tired. Not physically. It was a kind of emotional fatigue I recognized from years working night shifts. I knew it well, the weight of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She would sit on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, answering my questions with one-word replies. Sometimes she looked like she wanted to say something else. Sometimes she didn't look at me at all. I wanted to ask her if she was happy. But you can't ask that without sounding like you're accusing someone of being unhappy. So I made her tea and cut fruit and offered her soft things to hold, like I used to when she was a child. Eric, on the other hand, always came with a purpose. He walked around the house like he was inspecting it. Not for charm, not for memories, but for equity. I once caught him counting outlets. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice during a visit with your mother-in-law. He wasn't cruel, not in the way most people imagine cruelty. He was subtle, strategic, always courteous, always careful with his words. But the space between his sentences was where the real message lived. One evening, after they left, I noticed a drawer in my bedroom slightly ajar. Inside, things had been shifted. My old jewelry box was out of place. Papers that I kept tucked away were left crooked. I knew what was happening, but I also knew better than to confront it head on. Years as a nurse taught me to observe first, respond later. Lois, my neighbor, lived alone too. She was in her 70s, walked with a slight limp from an old injury, and had the sharpest eyes on the street. She watered her roses at 6 in the morning, even in the rain. She never gossiped, never joined the neighborhood gatherings, but she saw everything. She once told me, without looking up from her hose, men like Eric don't knock down doors. They wear down hinges. I didn't ask her what she meant. I just nodded. There was a day I remember clearly. A Sunday. Bree came over alone. No Eric. Her eyes looked different that day. Softer. A little puffy. She sat down at the kitchen table, and before I could ask, she said, "He thinks I'm too emotional." I didn't respond. I waited. She continued, "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing." It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in months. She left before sunset, said she had things to do. I stood in the doorway and watched her get into the car, her shoulders hunched like she was cold, though the weather was warm. After she left, I went into her old room. Everything was just as she left it 10 years ago. Posters peeling, drawers stuffed with old notebooks, a faded soccer trophy. I sat on the edge of her bed, holding a sweater she had left behind. I remembered the night she was born. Hank had paced the hospital hallway for 2 hours, convinced something was wrong. I had to reassure him 5 times that early labor didn't mean disaster. When she finally arrived, he cried harder than she did. We raised her with everything we had. We didn't have much money, but we had stability, laughter, and a kind of quiet love you didn't need to explain. I worked double shifts so she could attend her dream university. I missed birthdays and anniversaries, but I never missed tuition payments. Now I lived in a house full of old memories and too many locks. But something inside me had shifted since that day in court, since the judge froze, since I saw, just for a moment, the look on Eric's face, not confusion, but worry. They thought I was alone. They thought I was predictable. But I wasn't done yet. It was a Thursday afternoon when Bree and Eric showed up again, this time without calling first. I was folding laundry in the den, an old jazz record playing softly in the background when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Bree holding a foil-covered pie dish and Eric standing behind her with a clipboard and a manila envelope. "Surprise," Bree said, trying to smile. I stepped aside and let them in. Bree walked toward the kitchen and set the pie on the counter. The smell of cinnamon and apples drifted through the air, warm, nostalgic. It was the same recipe I used to make when Bree had the flu as a child. Eric didn't sit. He never did. He walked around the kitchen, tapping the envelope against his palm. "You've been on my mind," he said, like he'd thought of me out of kindness. Bree poured tea without asking. 2 cups. She set one in front of me, the other for herself, and then sat across the table. Eric remained standing, hovering like a shadow that didn't quite belong in the light. "We've been talking," Bree began, "and we think it might be time to consider what's best for you going forward." My hands wrapped around the warm mug. I said nothing. The room was too quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old clock above the stove. Eric cleared his throat. "We're looking at options. Retirement communities, assisted living places. There's one just 10 minutes from here. Great staff, great amenities. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Bree nodded, her eyes focused on the pie. "We thought it might be good for you. Social. Safe." "And," Eric added, laying the envelope on the table, "we can help with the logistics. Property, finances, all of it. It's too much for you to manage alone." I didn't reach for the envelope. I looked at Bree instead. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around the teacup, knuckles pale. "I haven't said I'm moving," I said calmly. Eric smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. We're just preparing. No pressure. But it's best to have things in place. These papers," he gestured to the envelope, "are just a start. Preliminary transfer documents, power of attorney, things we can adjust as needed." The pie sat in the center of the table, untouched. I stood up, walked to the drawer, and pulled out a knife. Bree flinched slightly, and I saw Eric shift his weight, watching me carefully. I sliced into the pie slowly, each movement deliberate, and placed a piece on a plate in front of Bree. "It smells like second grade," she whispered. I smiled. "That's when you broke your arm falling off the monkey bars. I made you 3 of these in 1 week." Eric didn't take a slice. He leaned forward, tapping the envelope once more. "We're just trying to make this easy for you," he said. "I see," I said, sitting back down. I pushed the plate toward Bree. "Eat. It's still warm." She picked up a fork and took a small bite. Her eyes closed for a second, like the taste brought something back she hadn't realized she missed. Eric's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it before silencing it quickly. I let the silence settle again. It was a tactic I'd learned from years of working with patients. Silence unnerves the ones who expect control. "You've been managing your finances fine," Bree said, but her tone lacked conviction. "But the taxes, the insurance, it's a lot." "Funny," I said, my voice even. "I don't recall asking for help." "We're trying to protect you," Eric replied. "From what?" I asked. He hesitated. I picked up my fork, took a bite of pie. The crust was slightly underbaked. Bree had never quite learned the patience for baking. "I have no intention of selling this house," I said quietly. Eric straightened. "That's not really the point. You might not even be allowed to keep it if something happens. The system doesn't work in your favor when you're on your own." Bree set down her fork. "Mom, please." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The lines under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her mouth pulled slightly downward at rest. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm not signing anything today." Eric let out a breath through his nose. "You don't have to sign today. Just read it." I didn't pick up the envelope. I simply said, "Leave it on the counter. I'll look when I'm ready." He didn't hide his disappointment. Bree stood and walked to the window, her arms folded across her chest. When they left, they took the envelope with them. That night, I sat in the living room with a slice of pie on my lap, the rest untouched on the counter. The house creaked gently in the wind, and the clock ticked like a heartbeat. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply sat. But the next morning, when I went to water the plants in the backyard, I noticed something. A tiny scrape on the back door lock. Fresh. Barely visible. That evening, I checked my documents. A few were missing, nothing important, just old hospital records, insurance forms, but I knew where I'd left them. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the drawer they'd once been in. Then I turned to the sideboard, an old oak piece Hank had built himself. Its surface was worn from years of use, but the craftsmanship was solid. It was where we kept wedding photos, old letters, his pocket watch. I'd always assumed the sideboard had only 3 drawers, but when I ran my hand along the back panel of the bottom one, I felt something strange. A ridge, a false panel, and something shifted. The knock on the door came earlier than usual. I hadn't finished my tea yet. Outside, the morning fog still curled around the mailbox like smoke that refused to rise. I opened the door to find Eric standing on the porch, dressed in a tailored navy suit. His tie was too perfect for a casual visit. Behind him was a man I didn't recognize, younger, clean-shaven, and holding a briefcase. "Good morning, Tessa," Eric said smoothly, like he'd rehearsed it. "This is Nathan Clark. He's here to help us clarify a few things legally." Nathan offered a polite, professional smile. I didn't return it. "I wasn't expecting company," I said, stepping aside out of habit more than invitation. They entered like they'd done it before, like it was theirs already. Eric moved toward the dining table, spreading out a stack of papers like a magician preparing a trick. Nathan pulled out a chair, sat down, and opened his briefcase with practiced ease. "These are some simplified versions of the forms we discussed," Eric said. "Just a few signatures here and there to make sure everything is clean. No more confusion down the line." "I don't recall discussing anything," I replied. Eric chuckled under his breath. "Right. Well, we just want to make sure your wishes are honored. You said before that you wanted Bree to be safe, and we just want to formalize that. That's all." I noticed something then. A familiar folder, one I had kept in my bedroom drawer, was now in Nathan's stack. I didn't say anything. Lois was watering her roses again, her back slightly bent but her eyes quick. She looked up as I walked toward the window, our eyes meeting just for a second. I turned back to Eric and Nathan. "You'll have to excuse me. I wasn't planning on guests this morning. I need a moment." I walked into the kitchen slowly, keeping my steps steady, even. Once I was out of view, I leaned against the counter and took a deep breath. My heart beat fast, but not from fear, from calculation. When I returned, I had 3 cups of tea on a tray. I placed them gently on the table. Nathan began speaking, but I raised a hand. Before we continue, I'd like to understand something. Eric leaned back. Of course. Why now? I asked, looking at both of them. Why the rush? You've lived in your apartment just fine for years. I've lived here just fine. What changed? Eric smiled too quickly. It's not a rush. We just think it's time to prepare. You've been a bit forgetful lately. I sat down slowly. Forgetful. He nodded. Just little things. You left the oven on. You repeated yourself at dinner last month. It's nothing dramatic, but it's time to have safeguards. That's all. I stirred my tea. So you think I'm incapable? Not incapable, Nathan said smoothly, just vulnerable to confusion. This paperwork protects you from making unintended mistakes. I sipped my tea, then set the cup down. You're right. Mistakes do happen. Eric looked satisfied. Exactly. I made one when I trusted you, I said. The air in the room shifted. Eric's smile twitched. Nathan cleared his throat and pulled forward a document. This one here just verifies your agreement to allow Eric to manage affairs in your name if needed. Bree has already signed her portion. I didn't touch it. Did she? He nodded. And where is she now? Resting. She hasn't been feeling well, Eric said quickly. I hope she's all right, I said. She didn't seem herself last week. She's fine, Eric said sharply. I looked down at the documents. The language was dense, but familiar. Medical proxy, financial access, asset management. There was a form granting power of attorney, another involving property transfer under duress, disguised under legalese. I recognized the handwriting in the margins. It was not mine. What's this? I asked, pointing. Eric glanced. Just a note you made during our last conversation. I didn't write that, I said quietly. Nathan looked uncertain. Eric shrugged. You probably don't remember. We had a long talk that afternoon. No, I said, my voice flat. I didn't write it. And I didn't authorize you to go through my desk. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the front door creaked open slightly. I turned to see Lois standing just inside, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand. I knocked, she said calmly. No one answered. Eric looked annoyed. Do you mind? This is a private matter. It won't be for long, Lois replied. She walked over and placed the paper on the table. I wrote a statement. I saw you take boxes out of her house 3 nights ago without permission. Eric paled. That's not true. It is, Lois said. And I'll say it under oath if I have to. Nathan closed his briefcase without another word. Eric turned to me, his voice lower. You're making this harder than it has to be. I looked at him. You made it hard the moment you treated me like a piece of property. He didn't respond, just gathered the papers and stormed toward the door. Lois looked at me once he was gone. You all right? I nodded. Yes, thank you. We stood in silence for a moment. Then she added, They always smile first, then they start locking doors behind you. That night, I sat alone at the oak sideboard, running my fingers along the edge of the drawer. I pressed gently at the back panel. It clicked open. The soft click echoed louder than expected. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid the false panel aside, revealing a shallow compartment hidden at the back of the drawer. Dust clung to the edges, untouched for years. Inside, there was a small black pouch tied with a faded red ribbon, a sealed envelope, and a thin leather-bound notebook. I carried everything to the kitchen table, setting them down gently like artifacts from another life. The envelope had my name on it, written in Hank's handwriting, firm, upright letters I hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't open it yet. Not right away. I started with the notebook. Inside were records, dates, figures, notes in Hank's familiar shorthand, investment details, bank transfers, properties listed under holding companies I'd never heard of. One entry stood out: Orchid Lane Complex, transferred to TH per trust clause. I blinked. Orchid Lane? That was the apartment block where Bree and Eric had lived for the past 3 years. I turned the page. A second property, then a third, a foundation, a holding in a mid-sized development firm. My name appeared again and again, not as a beneficiary, but as an owner. Quiet, legal, untouched. He never told me. I sat back, the notebook resting in my lap. The house was silent except for the ticking clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I stared out the window at the garden, watching a single leaf drift downward. Then I opened the envelope. Tessa, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally found the drawer I built. I figured you would, eventually. You always saw what others missed. I didn't want to burden you while I was alive. I know how heavy the world gets when you carry too many truths at once. But I also know you've always been stronger than you realize. I've made some investments over the years, quiet ones, nothing flashy, just enough to build something steady, something yours. The apartment block on Orchid Lane is in your name. So are the other properties in this folder. I wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of, not just with money, but with dignity. I watched how people looked at you, how they underestimated you. I never did. If Bree finds this too, remind her. Wealth is not about control. It's about stewardship. What we build, we pass on, not through force, but through grace. Love, Hank. My throat tightened. I reread the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He had planned this. He knew the world, and perhaps even our daughter, would one day doubt me. So he left me a map, not to escape, but to reclaim. The next morning, I called Victoria. She was a voice from another chapter of our lives, an old friend of Hank's from his college years, now a partner at a law firm downtown. We hadn't spoken in a while, but when she answered, I heard the warmth return instantly. Tessa, my God, it's been years. I need your help, I said. I'm listening. Within the hour, I was in her office, sitting across from her at a desk that gleamed like it had never known dust. I handed her the documents and the letter. She read in silence, her eyes scanning each page with a lawyer's precision and a friend's quiet awe. After she finished, she leaned back and looked at me. You realize what this means, right? I think I'm starting to. You don't just own the property Bree and Eric live in. You're also a majority shareholder in the company Eric works for, Orchid Lane Holdings. It's part of a larger group. I exhaled slowly. He doesn't know. Not yet, she said, but he will. We spent the next hour drafting notices, letters of intent, legal advisories. We put together a timeline and outlined next steps. Victoria moved quickly, efficiently, with a fire I hadn't seen in years. By the time I left her office, the sky had begun to cloud over, but I didn't mind. I felt clearer than I had in weeks. At home, I stood in the hallway near the bedroom and stared at the oak sideboard. How many years had I walked past it without knowing what it held? How many times had I dusted it, opened its drawers, and never seen the door Hank left for me? Sometimes, the most important things are hidden in plain sight. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table. The house bathed in the soft glow of the lamp above. I sipped my tea and opened the pouch from the hidden drawer. Inside was a small silver key. No tag, no label, just cold metal and quiet promise. I didn't know what it opened. Not yet. But something told me I would soon. The letter was delivered 2 days later, wrapped in a crisp white envelope with Victoria's firm's name embossed in clean silver lettering. I didn't need to read it again. I had reviewed every word with her the night before, but holding it in my hand still felt momentous. It was addressed to the board of Orchid Lane Holdings, the mid-tier property development company where Eric worked. Victoria had verified everything. I wasn't just a shareholder, I was the majority owner. Through a network of silent trusts and transfers Hank had created years ago, the company bore my name in places Eric had clearly never thought to look. I made myself tea that morning, chamomile, my favorite, and sat in the sunroom where the morning light touched the armrest of Hank's old chair. I watched the steam curl upward and disappear into the air. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Like the pieces of a long-forgotten song were starting to come together in my mind. The doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Bree and Eric standing there again, this time with stiff smiles and tired eyes. Eric held a phone in one hand, glancing down at it periodically like he was waiting for a text he hoped wouldn't come. "We thought we'd drop by," Bree said. "I can see that," I replied. They followed me inside. Bree busied herself in the kitchen, unwrapping another pie, store-bought this time. She didn't make eye contact. Eric stayed near the entryway, his movements more hesitant than usual. I poured 3 cups of tea. When I handed Eric his, he looked at it like it was a negotiation. "We got a strange email this morning," he said. I stirred my own tea gently. "Did you?" He pulled out his phone, scrolling. It said there's a change in the ownership structure at Orchid Lane Holdings. Said the majority shareholder filed a request for full financial audit and a revised board vote. I nodded. "That's correct." He blinked. "You?" "I did," I said, sipping slowly. Bree looked between us, her brow furrowed. "I don't understand." I placed my cup down on its saucer. "Your father left me certain assets. I only recently discovered them. One of those assets happens to be the building you're living in, and the company Eric works for." The silence was immediate and sharp. Eric set his cup down harder than necessary. "You're saying you own the building?" "I'm saying I own several," I replied. "That one included." He laughed once, short, breathy. "This is ridiculous." "I've already sent notices to the property management firm," I continued. "Rent will remain the same, of course, but certain tenants will be reviewed." "You can't evict us," Eric snapped. "I haven't," I said calmly, "but I am within my rights to ask anyone misusing company resources to vacate." Bree stepped forward, her voice soft. "Mom, are you sure about all this?" "I'm certain." Eric's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and his face lost what little color it had. Bree noticed. "What is it?" He didn't answer. I stood and walked to the hallway drawer, pulling out a printed document. "This came yesterday. It's a summary of the company's board shares. Your name isn't on it, Eric. Mine is." He stared at me, eyes narrowed. "You've been planning this." "No," I said. "Your father did. I'm just honoring it." Eric's jaw tightened. "You know what this means for me? If this gets around, I lose leverage at the firm I've been working on a deal for months. If they think I lied about my connections to the property, I'm not responsible for the image you chose to create," I said quietly. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping hard against the tile. Bree flinched. "You think this fixes something," he said. "You think this gives you the right to meddle in my life?" I didn't reply. He took a breath, as if about to say more, then stopped. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him. Bree stayed seated, her eyes downcast. She didn't speak for a moment. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I believe you," I replied. She looked at me then. Really looked. "I haven't been myself for a long time." I nodded. "I know." We sat in silence for a while. She picked up her teacup but didn't drink. Then in a low voice she said, "He's been under pressure. With work, with money. He's not always like this." "Pressure doesn't excuse cruelty," I said, "and it certainly doesn't excuse deception." She nodded slowly. That evening, Victoria stopped by. I handed her a small black device I had found hidden behind a potted plant in the living room. She examined it, turned it over in her hand, then nodded. "Recording device," she said. "We'll document it, establish the chain of custody." I watched as she sealed it in a labeled envelope and signed the date on the back. Outside, the sky was turning the color of ash. I stood on the porch for a long time after she left, the cool air brushing against my skin. Things weren't finished, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like someone being acted upon. I felt like someone making decisions. The moving truck arrived just after noon. I saw it through the lace curtains as it rumbled down the street, too large, too loud for our quiet neighborhood. A man in a red vest jumped out of the passenger side and began unfolding the metal ramp before the truck even came to a full stop. I had been expecting them. I made tea. Strong black tea this time, the kind Hank used to drink when he needed clarity. I sat by the front window facing the door, one hand on my cup, the other resting on the table beside the documents Victoria had helped me prepare. Eric came in first, as usual. He didn't knock. He rarely did anymore. Bree followed close behind, her eyes already apologizing for something she hadn't said yet. Behind them, two men in navy shirts began walking up the porch steps with cardboard boxes and collapsible bins. "We're just here to get started," Eric said, not looking at me. "You don't need to do anything, just relax, let the professionals handle it." "Started with what?" I asked, lifting the cup to my lips. "Packing," he said simply. "We'll move the fragile items last. Bree and I have already discussed this." My eyes shifted to Bree. She looked away. "I don't recall agreeing to anything being packed," I said calmly. Eric stepped further into the room. "It's not a negotiation, Tessa. We're doing what's best." "For whom?" I asked. He ignored the question and motioned for the movers to begin. One of them looked uncertain, pausing halfway through the doorway. That's when I stood up. I walked slowly to the hallway cabinet and retrieved a folder. I placed it on the dining table and opened it, laying out copies of title deeds, ownership records, and property filings. "Before you put anything in a box," I said, "you should read these." Eric frowned. He stepped over and scanned the papers, then picked one up. "You had these drawn up?" "They've existed for years," I said. "Hank prepared everything. I just never knew until recently." He flipped through the documents, his movements more rushed now. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "I am, and so is the company that now recognizes me as the legal property owner. That includes the house you're standing in and the building where you live." His mouth opened, then closed again. I could see the shift happening, panic creeping into calculation. Bree walked to the table slowly, lifting a paper and reading it for herself. "Is this real?" she asked, almost to herself. Eric stepped between us. "Even if it is, it doesn't mean you can just—" "I can," I said, "and I have." "I have rights," he said tightly. "You have a lease," I corrected, "which is now subject to review, as is your employment at Orchid Lane Holdings. They received notice of your unreported conflict of interest this morning." Eric's face went pale. "You don't understand how this works. If this falls apart, I'm done at the firm." I tilted my head. "That's not my doing, that's yours." He turned abruptly, pulling out his phone and walking into the hallway. I could hear his voice rising on the other side of the wall. Bree sat down, stunned. She kept rereading the documents as though they might change. I returned to the kitchen and poured another cup of tea. The steam rose gently, curling in the still air. When I returned, Victoria was on speakerphone, her voice clear and direct. "Documentation has been filed," she said. "Eric Welling's legal representative was copied. We have confirmation of chain of custody for the device you turned over. A formal letter will follow." "Thank you, Victoria," I said. Bree looked up, startled. "What device?" I glanced toward the potted plant near the fireplace. Eric placed a listening device in this house. I found it. Victoria cataloged it yesterday. Bree's face crumpled. "He said he was just checking in," she whispered. "He said it was to make sure I was safe, that you weren't unstable. My jaw tightened. I know. She covered her mouth with her hand. I could see the pieces snapping together in her mind. Months of little things, explained away, softened, hidden under concern, now realigning into something much colder. The front door slammed. Eric reappeared, his expression carved from stone. "This isn't over," he said. I stood and faced him. "You're right," I said. "It's not, but this time you're not the one who decides how it ends." He stared at me for a long second, then turned and walked out the door. Bree sat motionless. Outside, the truck idled, waiting for orders that would never come. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the mailbox. Lois was out front, pruning the bushes near her porch. She didn't speak, but she gave me a nod, a knowing one. I returned it. Inside, the house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from fear or absence. This was something else. A quiet earned. It started with a slammed door. Not the kind that echoes, but the kind that lands like a final word. Eric stormed back into the house just before dusk, his shoes dragging small clumps of dirt onto my clean floor. Bree and I were sitting in the living room. She had barely spoken in an hour, her eyes swollen from whatever storm she was weathering inside. I had made her a warm cup of milk. She hadn't touched it. Eric's eyes burned. He looked from Bree to me, then back again. "We're not done." "No one said we were," I replied. He walked toward the center of the room, pacing, turning once, then stopping like he couldn't decide which fire to throw himself into. His jaw tightened. "I've given you time. I've tried to be reasonable," he said, voice shaking. "But this little stunt of yours ruined everything." He turned to Bree. "And you just sit there? You don't say a word?" She looked at him. Really looked. Her face was pale, lips pressed together like she was holding in a scream that had lived there for years. "You lied to me," she said quietly. His face twisted. "I did this for us. You put a recording device in my mother's house," she said. "You forged her signature. You tried to control everything, me, her, all of it. That's not for us. That's for you." He stared at her, eyes narrowing. "You're being emotional." Her hand went to her stomach without thinking. Just a small touch. Protective, almost unconscious. "You think I haven't noticed how tired you are lately?" he said. "How forgetful. Maybe you should be the one evaluated, not her." That's when I stood. "Leave," I said. He ignored me. "You don't know what it's like, Bree. The pressure I'm under. The expectations. The firm." "Stop," she said suddenly, standing. "Just stop." He froze. Her voice trembled, but she didn't sit back down. "I didn't tell you. I haven't told anyone yet, but I'm pregnant." The room fell into silence. Eric blinked. Bree's hand was still on her stomach. 8 weeks. He said nothing. "I haven't decided what I'm doing yet," she continued. "I haven't even had time to breathe." Eric stepped closer. "Then we need to talk about options." She stepped back. "Don't." "You're not ready for this," he said. "You're not strong enough." That was when his hand twitched, just slightly, the smallest motion, and the moment passed. But I saw it, and I stepped between them. "You're not going to raise your hand," I said. "Not here, not now, not ever." Eric's breath came in shallow waves. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves against the windows like fingernails on glass. "You don't have a say," he hissed. "I have every right to protect my daughter," I replied. He scoffed. "You think any of this is going to hold? You think your little folder of papers means anything once I take this to court?" "You already did," I said, "and I hope you remember that when the hearing begins." He paused, something flickering in his expression. "I don't need a fight," he said finally. "I need peace. We can fix this." "No," Bree whispered. "You don't get to fix something you broke on purpose." Eric looked at her again, and this time there was no anger, no arrogance, just something hollow, A man realizing the floor beneath him wasn't made of concrete after all. He turned without another word and walked out the front door. We listened to the footsteps fade, then the car door slam, then silence. I reached for Bree's hand. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder like she had when she was 5 and afraid of thunder. The next day, Victoria came by with a sealed envelope. She placed it gently on the table. "It's done," she said. "The recording device was documented properly. The audio content is usable. We've submitted it, along with the financial records, forged documents, and timeline." "Thank you," I said. "There's one more thing," she added. "Mason called me. Said Eric left him a message a few days ago. Something about margin calls and the firm losing patience. I think he's falling apart faster than he's letting on." I nodded. Victoria looked at Bree, then at me. "This case won't be easy, but we're in a better position now, stronger." That night, Bree sat in her childhood bedroom while I folded linens in the hallway. I heard her moving things, opening drawers that hadn't been touched in years. She found a photo of Hank and smiled for the first time in days. Later, when I passed by her door, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, the photo in one hand, the other resting again on her stomach. She looked up at me and whispered, I think I want to keep her." I nodded. "Then we will." And for the first time in a long time, I saw not just a daughter, but a woman standing on the edge of becoming something new. The call came mid-morning, just after I'd washed the breakfast dishes and placed the chipped mug back in its usual spot near the window. Mason's voice was still as warm and gravelly as I remembered, though slower now, like the years had smoothed down his edges. "I've been meaning to check in," he said. "Saw your name in some property records last week. Made me curious." Mason had worked alongside Hank for nearly a decade. They'd built systems no one ever saw, signed off on budgets that quietly made fortunes for other people. He'd retired just before Hank passed, retreating to a quiet life up north. "I could use a coffee," he added, "if you're up for it." We met at the diner 2 blocks from my house. The place hadn't changed much since the 90s. Same cracked red booths, same smell of burnt toast and cheap bacon grease. Mason ordered black coffee. I asked for chamomile. "You look good," he said. "Better than I expected, after all I've heard." I raised an eyebrow. "And what have you heard?" He hesitated. "That your daughter's husband has been making moves, unethical ones." I didn't flinch. "You're not wrong." He pulled out a thin folder from his coat. "This might help you then. Hank kept backups of everything. He wasn't a man who believed in loose ends." I opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of donation receipts, internal memos, and a financial statement from a fund Hank had quietly created during his final years, the Grace Trust. "This was his project," Mason said. "He wanted to support women over 60, widows, single women, anyone isolated. Said too many of them gave their lives to others and got forgotten." My eyes filled before I could stop them. "I didn't know about this," I said. "Hank didn't advertise it, but he told me it was in your name. Said when the time was right, you'd find it." I nodded, swallowing hard. "And Bree?" He sighed. 3 years ago, she came to the office while Hank was sick, asked about the trust, wanted access, said she needed help, but Hank told her no. She never told me. She looked desperate, Mason added gently, but not dishonest, just lost. Hank was shaken afterward, said he didn't know how to help her without enabling something worse. We sat in silence for a while. I traced the edges of the paper, the ink smudges, Hank's initials scrawled in his usual slant. So much of him still lived in these careful details. When I got home, the house felt colder than usual. Bree was out walking. The clouds had gathered thick overhead, a quiet gray pressing down on the world. I walked into the kitchen and reached for my favorite mug. My fingers stopped when I saw the crack again, tiny, harmless, but persistent. I ran my thumb across it slowly, like reading Braille. I didn't know why, but something about that little imperfection always brought me back to the night Hank told me about his diagnosis. We'd sat in silence for hours that night. I hadn't cried, neither had he. We'd just held hands, warm tea growing cold between us. And then he whispered, "The world leaves chips in us. We carry them, and we keep going." I placed the mug beside the teapot and lit a candle. That evening, Bree returned with leaves in her hair and a softness in her expression. She seemed lighter, though still quiet. She found me sitting on the porch, a shawl around my shoulders, the folder from Mason open beside me. "What's that?" she asked. "Your father's trust," I said. "He built it for women like me." Her brow furrowed. "And I found out you asked for access, years ago." She stiffened. "I'm not angry," I added. "I'm just wondering why you didn't tell me." Her shoulders sagged. She sat beside me slowly, fingers folding in her lap. "I was scared," she admitted. "We were in debt. Eric said it was temporary. He made it sound like a solution. Said if I could pull some money from a family trust, no one would get hurt. I believed him." "Did he pressure you?" She nodded. "But I agreed. That part's on me." The porch light flickered above us. Bree leaned into the silence for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't know how to come back from it, so I just didn't." "I would have helped you," I said gently. "I know, but I didn't want you to see me like that." "I've seen you in every way," I replied. "Sick, scared, strong, stubborn. There's nothing left to prove." She looked down, and for the first time I saw not guilt, but grief. "I miss him," she whispered. "Me too." We sat there for a while, two women in the dusk, holding memory like it was something warm and breakable. Inside, the candle flickered against the window glass, casting dancing shadows onto the wall. The knock at the door came just as I was finishing the dishes. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it to find a woman in her early 40s, standing on the porch in a crisp charcoal suit. Her dark hair was tied into a low bun, and she carried herself like someone who had never once been ignored in a courtroom. "Mrs. Harwood?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm Cassandra Hall. I represent Eric Welling." I stepped aside. "Of course you do." She entered without hesitation, her eyes scanning the living room with clinical precision, like she was mentally measuring its value. She declined the tea I offered. Instead, she placed a slim folder on the coffee table and sat upright, her knees perfectly aligned. "Let's not waste time," she said. "My client has authorized me to discuss a potential settlement. No court, no press. Clean resolution." I raised an eyebrow. "Resolution for what?" "Eric is prepared to withdraw all claims to your assets," she continued, "including the house, the trust, and any properties associated with Orchid Lane Holdings. In return, he would like to retain his current residence and a modest severance from the company." I leaned back slightly. "That's generous." She met my gaze. "He's also willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding all personal and financial matters related to your family." Bree stepped into the room just then, pausing when she saw Cassandra. "Is that her?" she asked, her voice low. Cassandra gave her a brief nod but didn't rise. "Ms. Harwood, I understand you're under stress. I'm not here to stir more conflict." Bree crossed her arms. "You represent a man who installed a microphone in my mother's home." "I represent the interests of my client," Cassandra replied evenly, "and I'm here because he's losing leverage fast." That caught my attention. She opened her folder. "I'm going to be transparent. Eric's facing internal investigation at his firm. There are recordings, documents, emails. Some of them may implicate him in coercive conduct. My firm will not defend him in a criminal case." "You're withdrawing," I said. She nodded. "I came to see if we could settle before the damage is irreversible. But I won't stay on his legal team if this continues to escalate. I've seen where this ends." She reached into the folder again and pulled out a sheet of paper. "This," she said, "is a sworn statement from a former co-worker. A woman who claims Eric pressured her into terminating a pregnancy in exchange for a promotion. She came forward last week." Bree went pale. Cassandra continued, "If that document reaches a judge, the family court filing Eric submitted, his request to be named Bree's guardian due to mental instability, won't just be thrown out. It will damage his reputation beyond repair." I took a long breath. "And you think he deserves a quiet exit?" She hesitated. "I think he's outmatched, and I think you have enough firepower to bury him, but sometimes it's better to win with grace." "Grace," Bree whispered as if tasting the word. "I'll leave the proposal with you," Cassandra said, standing. "It's valid for 48 hours. After that, I'm no longer involved." I walked her to the door. Just before she stepped off the porch, she turned back and looked at me, not as a lawyer, but as a woman. "I read the documents your husband left," she said. "He planned well." "He did," I replied. She gave a small nod. "I hope you do too." When she was gone, Bree and I sat in silence. The folder lay open between us, its contents a strange mix of apology and confession. "Do you think he's really scared?" Bree asked. I thought for a moment. "I think he finally met someone who wouldn't look away." Bree's fingers moved toward the document Cassandra had left. She didn't touch it, just let her hand hover. "I feel stupid," she said, "for not seeing it sooner." "You weren't blind," I replied. "You were surviving." She nodded slowly. That evening, Victoria came by. She brought a flash drive containing copies of the company's internal communications, including emails where Eric had exaggerated his connections to real estate assets he didn't own. She also handed me a summary of the trust's portfolio, assets now legally in my control. "Cassandra's visit tells me they're buckling," Victoria said, "but we don't let up." "Understood," I said. Bree handed her the proposal from Cassandra. "He wants to walk away." Victoria scanned it quickly. "He can walk, but he doesn't get to decide where the door is." Before she left, Victoria placed a thin envelope on the table. "By the way, this came from the county clerk's office. Eric filed for guardianship over Bree. It's still active. But now that we have medical documentation, his own emails, the recordings, it'll collapse in court." Bree reached for the envelope, but her hands trembled. I picked it up for her. "Let them try," I said. Outside, the sky broke open with a soft drizzle, the first real rain of the season. It tapped against the windows like a heartbeat returning after too long a sleep. We didn't turn on the lights. We just sat together, surrounded by truth, no longer afraid of the dark. The night before the hearing, the house was silent in a different way. Not the cold, watchful silence that had filled it in recent months, but a tender, waiting stillness. As if every photograph on the wall, every worn cushion and shadowed hallway understood something was about to shift. I had just finished folding the last of the laundry when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Bree stood in the doorway, her face bare, hair tied back loosely, wearing an old college sweatshirt I hadn't seen in years. "Can't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head. "You?" I smiled faintly. "Not yet." She came to sit beside me at the kitchen table. I poured her a cup of warm milk, just like I used to when she was little and woke from bad dreams. She wrapped her hands around the mug but didn't drink. We sat in silence for a while. The clock above the stove ticked softly, steady and unbothered. Then she reached into her pocket and unfolded a piece of paper. It was yellowed at the corners, carefully preserved. "I found this in one of Dad's books," she said. "It's a letter. From him. To me." She handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine. "Bree, if you ever find this, it means I didn't get the chance to say everything I wanted. I don't know what kind of woman you've become, but I hope she's one who questions the world and trusts herself more than anyone's expectations. You come from strong people. Never forget that. Love always, Dad." I returned the letter without a word. Bree folded it gently and held it to her chest. "I was angry at him for a long time," she whispered, "for leaving, for not saying more." "You were young?" I said. "You needed someone to blame." I didn't think I'd ever be the kind of woman he believed I could be. "You are," I said softly. "You're still becoming her." She finally took a sip of milk, then set the cup down. Her eyes met mine. "There's something else," she said. "Something I didn't tell you about Eric." I waited. "During my first pregnancy," she began slowly, "he told me I wasn't ready, that a baby would ruin everything. He said I was too fragile, that if I didn't make the right choice, he'd leave." My hands tightened around my own mug. "I didn't want to," she continued, her voice cracking. "But I did. I thought, maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't enough." She covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook once, but she didn't cry. Not really, just trembled like someone finally letting something terrible fall from their arms. I reached out, placing a hand on hers. "You don't owe him your guilt." She nodded through the silence. Then she whispered, "I didn't know I was being controlled. I thought I was just being careful." "People like him blur the difference," I said. "It's how they win." We stayed like that for a while, our hands linked, the weight between us a little less heavy. Then she asked the question I had known would come. "Will the judge even listen?" I exhaled. "He will." She looked at me, searching for something in my face. "You seem so sure." "I know him," I said. "A long time ago, before any of this. He was a young intern in the psychiatric wing at my hospital. He'd been assigned to shadow our unit, quiet. Always stayed late, but never spoke much. What happened? He broke down one night. Couldn't take the things he'd seen. He thought there was something wrong with him, that he didn't belong in law." I paused, remembering the hallway, the smell of antiseptic, the echo of his shoes. I sat with him, told him he didn't need to be like the others. He just needed to be decent, to be present. That was enough. "And now he's the judge?" I nodded. "His name is David Romero." Bree blinked. "He recognized you, didn't he?" I smiled. "He did. That's why he froze when I walked into court. And I think he remembers who I was when no one else did." The porch light flickered, a moth fluttering nearby. Bree looked toward the window. "I'm scared," she said. "I know," I said, "but you're not alone." She rested her head on my shoulder. Outside, the world was hushed, bracing for morning. Inside, we sat together, not as mother and daughter caught in a storm, but as two women who had survived the same weather. I thought of Hank then, his steady hands, the smell of cedar on his coat, the way he looked at Bree like she held every miracle in the world. I whispered into the stillness, "We're going to be okay." And for once, I truly believed it. The courthouse felt colder than I remembered, not from the air, but from the stillness, the kind that settles over a place where judgment is passed and futures bend quietly in different directions. Bree walked beside me, her steps slow but steady. Her hands were clasped around her abdomen, not just to shield but to anchor. We were dressed simply. I wore a navy dress Hank had once picked out for a retirement dinner I never attended. Bree wore pale gray, soft and solemn. No jewelry, no makeup, just the truth. Eric stood at the other end of the courtroom, flanked by two men in tailored suits. His posture was too straight, his smile too controlled, but his eyes darted, once toward us, then toward the door, as if hoping someone else might walk through and save him. He hadn't expected us to show. He certainly hadn't expected us to look composed. Victoria walked in next, her briefcase in hand, her chin lifted just enough to remind everyone she wasn't here to play defense. She took her seat beside us and whispered, "Everything's in place." Then the bailiff spoke. "All rise for Judge David Romero." The courtroom rose as one, and when Judge Romero entered, the sound of chairs scraping the floor vanished into the weight of recognition. He paused when he saw me. It was subtle, a flicker in his eyes, a breath that caught before he spoke. But I saw it. I saw the moment he remembered. He settled into his seat, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. This hearing will address guardianship petitions, property claims, and allegations of coercion and financial fraud, he said, his voice firm but even. We will proceed with full consideration for the rights of all parties. Eric's lawyer stood and launched into a polished statement, language polished like glass, carefully shaped to suggest concern, misunderstanding, and unfortunate miscommunications. He argued that Eric had acted in Bree's best interest, that I was unstable, that Bree was emotionally unfit, that the property ownership had been manipulated. The courtroom was quiet, but I could feel the mood shift. Eyes narrowed, postures stiffened. Then Victoria stood. Her tone was clean, deliberate. She walked the court through a timeline, emails Eric had written to colleagues boasting about real estate leverage, the forged documents we'd recovered, the internal company memos where he had misrepresented his role. She introduced the audio recording, Eric's voice clearly audible as he pressured Bree into silence, as he spoke of her emotional weaknesses and how he would manage me if needed. Judge Romero's eyes didn't leave the evidence screen. Then Victoria called her first witness, Mrs. Lois Donnelly. Lois entered the courtroom with quiet dignity. Her silver hair was tied back in a low twist, and she carried her cane like an afterthought. When asked, she confirmed she had witnessed Eric pressuring me, that she had seen him loading boxes from my home into his car without permission, that she had heard him speaking in tones not meant to be public. He looked at her like she was in the way. Lois said plainly, not like family, like an obstacle. Next, Victoria presented the psychological records, the report Bree had never seen, the one Eric had hidden. It confirmed Bree had experienced perinatal depression, that she had responded well to treatment, that she had not, under any clinical measure, been unfit for decision-making. The file included notes from the hospital psychiatrist noting concern about external manipulation from a spouse. Bree's hands shook as she read it, not from fear, but from the release of something long held in. Victoria rested a hand over hers. Then she turned to Judge Romero. "We don't need to destroy Mr. Welling," she said. "We only need to stop him from destroying anyone else." Then Romero looked at me. "Mrs. Harwood," he said, "do you wish to say anything before we recess?" I stood slowly. Every eye turned to me. "When I walked into this courtroom the first time," I began, "my daughter rolled her eyes. My son-in-law smirked. And then you looked up, Your Honor, and you froze." A beat of silence. I spent my life working in silence, helping others, cleaning wounds, holding hands no one else wanted to hold. I never thought I'd be in a courtroom, but here I am. I looked at Bree, then at Eric. I am not unstable. I am not confused. I am not weak, and neither is my daughter. Romero's gaze softened, just barely. Then he spoke. "I recognize Mrs. Harwood from my time at St. Agnes Hospital. I was a student then, unsure, uncertain. She once said something to me I never forgot. You don't have to be like everyone else. Just be kind to the people no one notices." He adjusted his glasses. "That's why I'm here today, and that's why I will proceed with full transparency and fairness. There is no conflict of interest, only history, and that history will not blind me. It will remind me what justice ought to look like." He banged the gavel once. The courtroom exhaled. "We will reconvene tomorrow for ruling," he said. "Until then, this court stands in recess." Eric turned sharply, muttering something to his lawyer, but there was no ground left to stand on. Outside the courthouse, Bree squeezed my hand. "I didn't know he'd remember you," she whispered. "Sometimes the quiet things last longest," I said. We stood under the bright morning sky, the courthouse doors behind us, the rest of the story waiting to be written. The next morning, the sky was washed clean by the storm that had rolled in during the night. Bree and I arrived at the courthouse early, the autumn wind tugging gently at our coats. She walked with her shoulders straighter than I'd seen in years. Her eyes were calm, not fearless but grounded. Inside the courtroom, there was less chatter than the day before. Even the journalists in the back row seemed more focused. Something in the air had shifted. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity of the truth finally taking its place in the room. Eric sat alone at the defendant's table. His lawyers hadn't returned. Cassandra had followed through. She'd withdrawn from the case. The man beside him now was someone younger, less polished, flipping through documents with growing panic. He looked at Bree once, and she didn't look away. Judge Romero entered, and the room rose. He adjusted his robe, glanced at the file before him, then began. This court has reviewed the evidence submitted in the matter of guardianship, property disputes, and allegations of coercion. The documents presented show a clear and sustained pattern of manipulation, misrepresentation, and abuse of legal and financial trust. Eric's new lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, may we request a delay for further—" "No," Romero said firmly. "You may not." Eric's mouth twitched. Romero continued, "I have spent my career believing in second chances, but that belief must be paired with accountability. And in this case, the evidence does not speak of misunderstanding. It speaks of intent." He turned toward Bree. "Ms. Harwood, do you wish to speak before I issue the court's findings?" Bree rose. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice was clear. "My name is Bree Harwood. I am 35 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have lived under a weight I thought was mine to carry. But it wasn't. That weight belonged to someone else's fear, someone else's ambition." She paused, glancing at Eric. "I loved a man who made me believe I was weak, who convinced me that being cautious was the same as being incapable. He told me what to think, what to wear, what to say. He decided when I was too emotional and when I was not emotional enough." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "In here is my medical file, one that was hidden from me. It proves I was not unstable. I was manipulated, and now I'm choosing not to be." Eric shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable for the first time. "I am expecting a child," Bree continued, "and I refuse to raise her in a world where silence is mistaken for consent." The room was still. Romero nodded once. "Thank you, Miss Harwood." He turned his attention to Eric. "Mr. Welling, your petition for guardianship is hereby denied. Your claims to any portion of the Harwood estate are dismissed with prejudice. You are ordered to vacate the residence at Orchid Lane within 30 days and to cease all communication with the petitioners, pending review of additional charges." Eric stood suddenly. "This is outrageous," he barked. "You're all against me. She's emotional. She's making this up." Romero didn't flinch. "Mr. Welling, if you raise your voice again, I will hold you in contempt." Eric looked around the room, seeking an ally, finding none. Even his new attorney stepped slightly away from him. "Do you know who I am?" he spat. Victoria rose slowly. "Yes," she said. "We all do now." Security approached. Eric muttered a final curse under his breath, then gathered his things and stormed out. The door slammed behind him, echoing down the hallway like a final chapter closing. Romero looked back at us. "This court stands adjourned." Outside, Bree and I stood beneath the old courthouse steps. She leaned into me and I held her the way I hadn't in years, not as a protector, but as someone who had finally been seen. "You were incredible," I whispered. She let out a shaky breath. "I didn't think I could do it." "You already did," I said, "and you'll keep doing it, one day at a time." Victoria joined us with a quiet smile. We'll follow up this week to finalize the property details. But for now, rest. I don't even know what rest feels like, Bree said, half laughing. It feels like breathing, I replied. That night, Bree and I sat on the porch with tea. The stars were faint behind the clouds, but we watched anyway. She told me about the names she was considering for the baby. I told her about the night I brought her home from the hospital and how Hank had insisted on playing a lullaby on a music box we still kept in the attic. She asked if we could find it. We did. It was still intact, still played that same soft tune, like nothing had happened in all those years. We wound it gently and let it sing into the silence. In that moment, everything felt quiet again, but not empty, just waiting. The morning Bree went into labor, the sky was just beginning to warm from navy to gold. I drove her to the hospital with both hands steady on the wheel and a silence between us that wasn't heavy. It was sacred. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She breathed, in and out, like she had done her whole life without realizing it, stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for. Hours passed like water, smooth and unhurried. I stayed in the room the whole time by her side when the contractions came closer, rubbing her back, holding her hand when she let me. She squeezed harder than I expected, her strength no longer hidden behind compromise. When the baby arrived, there was no dramatic scream or rush, just a quiet gasp from Bree, followed by the first sweet cry of a little girl. She named her Hope. The nurse placed the baby on Bree's chest, and I watched as my daughter closed her eyes and let the tears fall, no longer out of fear or grief, but something deeper, something clean. "She's perfect," Bree whispered. "She's free," I replied. Later, in the hospital room bathed in soft afternoon light, Bree slept while I cradled Hope in my arms. She was small and warm and impossibly still. I looked down at her and saw more than a newborn. I saw the ending of one story and the beginning of another. In her tiny face were pieces of all of us. Hank's strong chin, Bree's full lips, my nose. Generations folded into something new, something unbroken. I reached into my bag and pulled out the music box. I wound it once and held it close. The tune drifted softly through the room like a lullaby that remembered every night it had ever sung. Hope stirred, then settled. A few weeks later, back home, Bree and I stood in the hallway hanging a new picture on the wall. It was taken on Hope's first day home, Bree holding her daughter and me standing beside them, my hand resting on Bree's shoulder. 3 generations in a single frame. Next to it, we placed a photograph of Hank, one of the few he had taken smiling wide, arms crossed on the porch he had built himself. And beneath both, we placed a shadow box, the chipped mug, now sealed in glass, and the music box, still working after all these years. Across the living room, a sign above a cabinet read, "Garden of Grace." That had been Bree's idea. She wanted to start a foundation, not a massive one, just something small, intimate, steady, like her father would have built. A safe place for women to rest, to heal, to be believed. Not just for survivors, she said one evening as we planned out the first event, but for women like you, like Lois. Quiet women who did everything right and still got erased. We held our first meeting 2 months after Hope was born. 12 women came. They brought stories written in their bones, in their hands, in the quiet between their words. We didn't rush them. We made tea. We listened. We lit candles for the ones who weren't there yet. Hope lay in a bassinet beside us, a soft pink blanket rising and falling with her breath. At the end of the gathering, I stood and thanked them. "I spent most of my life thinking survival was the end goal," I said. "But I've learned something. Survival isn't the end. It's the beginning. The moment you choose to live on your own terms, that's when healing begins." The room was quiet, a different kind of quiet, one that hummed with possibility. Later that evening, as I held Hope in my lap, Bree leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she said. "It didn't," I whispered. "You arrived right on time." She smiled, eyes wet, voice calm. "You know what I realized?" she asked. "What?" "That all those nights I thought I was breaking. I was actually being rebuilt." Outside, the garden lights flickered on. The air smelled like mint and lilac and something else, something softer. And inside our little home, for the first time in a long time, we felt no need to look over our shoulders. The story wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but it was ours, and that made it enough.